So as we've seen in the past two lectures, attention seems to play a critical role in perception. We must attend to our world in order to perceive it, and indeed, when we're involved in tasks that are very difficult, that use up a lot of our attentional resource, we can misperceive things in our world, or even not perceive things at all. But attention might also play an important role as a coordinating system to keep track of sensory information. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to discuss what's called the binding problem and how attention helps solve the binding problem through a process known as feature integration. So what's the binding problem? Well, as we learned in lecture 7, neurons in primary visual cortex initially respond to basic features of images. Right? And so I proposed that the way vision works is the eyes, the retina, breaks images down into their basic components. Angled bars of light, size, color, shape. And feature detection cells in primary visual cortex respond to these basic features and build the image back up. And this process occurs via two streams, the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. So a stream that is concerned with where things are in space and how we interact with them, and a stream that's concerned with identifying objects. So if we're starting from basic features, how do we keep track of what features belong to the different objects that we look at in a scene? Right? So if you think about this situation where you're staring at a red triangle and a green circle, and neurons in primary visual cortex respond to the different features of these objects. How does the brain keep track of the fact that, red goes with the triangle, and the triangle is small, and green goes with the circle, and the circle is big? How does the brain bind those features together? So one idea is that attention allows us to solve this problem. By attending to objects in our world, attention effectively binds the features of objects together so that when we look at a green circle beside a red triangle, we actually perceive the circle as green and we perceive the triangle as red, because those features of those objects have been bound together by attention. And so this is known as feature integration theory. And it was first proposed by Ann Treisman in the 1980s to solve this binding problem. And this binding problem has been thought about for some time, ever since it was noted that cells in primary visual cortex seem to respond to basic features. If you look at multiple things, and there are different groups of cells in your brain responding to the features of those different things, how does your brain keep track of what goes with what? And so feature integration theory proposes that when you look at an object, the brain analyzes the features of that object, and cells in visual cortex respond to the features of the object. And then there's a focused attention stage where by focusing attention on the object, you can actually bind the features of the object together. So the cells that are firing for the different features that make up the object are bound together by attention, and you perceive the object as it actually looks, containing, the features that it actually has in the real world. And so this is feature integration theory. And so we can kind of think of features as components of a visual alphabet. And attention is kind of like a spotlight that binds features together into a whole. So do we have any evidence for feature integration theory? Do we have any evidence that the binding problem is actually a problem, right? You might look around your world and think, when I look at a red circle, I know that it's a red circle. I don't mix up features of objects. Well, actually, in some situations in the laboratory, we can actually make you swap features of things. And Treisman and Schmidt first showed this in the 1980s. So to test feature integration theory, they thought, well, if the binding problem is solved via attention, what we can do is we can stress the brain's attentional systems and see if this leads to mistakes. See if this leads to feature swaps, right? So you look at these objects, and because your attentional system is stressed, you don't bind their features together correctly. So you might actually perceive a red square and a blue circle, or a purple 5 and a yellow A. And so Treisman and Schmidt devised a study to test this. And participants had to basically divide their attention between two tasks, identifying numbers and identifying shapes, like those on the slide here. And so the way this experiment works is you fixate on a cross, and for 200 milliseconds, so just a brief flash, objects, shapes, letters, and numbers of different color and different sizes are shown to you. And this is followed by noise, and by visual noise, I should say, static. And the purpose of the noise is to sort of wash away the sensory trace of what you just saw. And then you're asked to recall what you just saw. So here's a demo of how the experiment works. And your attentional system is stressed in the study because the stimuli are presented for a very brief period of time, right? And so to perceive the blue square as blue, you have to look at it. You have to attend to it. To perceive the red square as red, you have to attend to it. But there's a very short amount of time to actually do this. So you're very quickly scanning your eyes around the screen, trying to take in each of the objects that you're seeing. So let's try this little experiment. So I'll have you fixate on the cross. And so your goal is to remember what you saw. And it's really that quick. So very difficult task. Let's do that again. So very, difficult task, really taxing of our attentional system. And the prediction, right, is because this task is so difficult, we're going to see feature swaps. And this will provide evidence for feature integration theory and the notion that attention solves the binding problem. And that's exactly what Treisman and Schmidt saw. So on about a quarter of trials, participants reported shapes made up of features from different stimuli, so-called illusory conjunctions. Right? So they may see a small red triangle, but they may report seeing a small yellow triangle. So they're swapping features between the things that they're seeing because their attentional system is taxed. And so under Treisman's model, what happens is that in this pre-attentive stage, if you look at an array of objects, all of their features are sort of freely floating around in your brain, represented by the firing of neurons in visual cortex. And attention combines these features together. Now, if your attentional system is taxed, is stressed, then these features might be bound together in ways that actually don't reflect reality. And that's exactly what they saw in this study. Very cool results and very compelling evidence for feature integration theory and the notion that attention solves the binding problem. What other evidence do we have for feature integration and the idea that attention helps us solve the binding problem? Well, we have some evidence from what's called conjunction searches. And so if you're looking at an array of objects, it's really easy to identify an object that differs from the other objects by one single feature. So for instance, if you look at this image here on the left, right, and I ask you, is there a black O in this array? Very easy to spot that black O, right? It differs from all the other objects by one feature, in this case, color. Doesn't matter that there are other O's in the array, they're a different color. Very easy to spot that black O. This is called a feature search. On the other hand, if I build an array that's made up of objects that share several different features, finding the black O is actually much more difficult, right? So in this array here, there are gray O's, black X's, and one black O. And so the thing you have to find is a conjunction of features in the array, right? It's a conjunction of a shape, a circle in this case, and a color, the color black. And so in this case, the search is a lot harder, and it actually takes you a bit more time to find the thing that you're looking for. Why is that? Well, Treisman would say it's because to do a conjunction search, you actually have to focus attention on each item in the array to bind the features of the items together so that you can actually, recognize what you're perceiving. In a feature search, you don't have to look at every single item. You're simply looking for one distinctive feature. So I'm going to show you an example of how this works, and hopefully it'll sort of paint the picture that conjunction searches are actually much more difficult than feature searches. So I'm going to ask you to find the red V. So you'll stare at a fixation cross, and you'll see an array of objects, and you'll have to quickly scan the objects to find the red V. So stare at the fixation cross. Okay, so that was probably pretty easy, and you probably spotted it in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. And that's because that red V had a unique feature, its color. No other objects in the array were red. And so that was a feature search. And so you didn't really have to scan the entire array, right? You could just look for that particular feature. It sort of popped out at you. Now let's do the same task, but in this case, the red V will be a conjunction of objects in the array. So stare at the fixation cross. So in the second case, we have a conjunction search. That red V is a conjunction of features, represents a conjunction of features, in this case, the color red and the letter V. So there were other V's in the array, they just weren't red. And in the second case, to spot that red V, you actually had to sort of scan your attention around the scene and look at the objects individually to bind their features together. And so what we know is that conjunction searches are just very slow. And the larger the set size, so the more objects that you have to scan, we can see that in this image here, the longer it takes you to find the target object that you're interested in. On the other hand, feature searches, doesn't matter how big the set size is. if the object you're looking for differs from the array, from the set, by a single feature, it just sort of pops out at you, and it's really easy to spot. So conjunction search versus feature search provides more evidence that to recognize objects, to perceive objects that are a conjunction of features, we actually have to look at them to bind their features together. And so this is further support for feature integration theory and the role of attention in solving the binding problem. Now, feature integration is a bottom-up process, right? Attention is being focused on sensory information, but top-down processing can play a role in helping us solve this binding problem. So when Treisman and Schmidt performed their study where they demonstrated that when the attentional system is taxed, they see these illusory conjunctions, they found that when participants were told they were seeing, things like a carrot, a lake, and a tire, when they were given some contextual information, and they could rely on memory and learning to predict the shape and color of the things they were about to see, there were fewer illusory conjunctions. So in everyday life, attention helps us solve the binding problem, but so does top-down information, right? We know how things should look. When you look at an apple, you know that it's either going to be red or green, right? Depending on the kind of apple it is, or yellow, I guess. And so, you're probably not going to make a mistake where you perceive an apple as purple, because memory suggests that that's just not going to happen. So we solve the binding problem via a combination of attention acting on sensory signals and prior knowledge. So now we're going to change topics a little bit and talk about attention and the brain. What's the brain basis of attention? And so we can look at a group of patients who have a disorder known as neglect. And typically these patients have damage somewhere in the right hemisphere, often in the parietal lobe. And these patients can't attend to things in their left visual field. It's a very odd and strange disorder. And so, for instance, if you had a neglect patient in the lab and you asked them to draw a flower, or a pear, or a clock, or a house, they only draw the right side of the object. If you showed them an array of stars and you asked them to cross out all of the stars that they see, they would only cross out the stars on the right side of the array. So they can't attend to their left visual field, and because of this, this seems to impair their perception of things in their left visual field. Finally, if you presented a neglect patient with a line and you said bisect the line, so draw another line through the middle of the line you're seeing, you get something like this. So again, they're only perceiving things in their right visual field, or at least that's what it seems. What do neglect patients know? So they don't show any conscious awareness of stimuli in their left visual field, so stimuli in the neglected visual field. However, they do seem to process what they're seeing, right? These visual signals are reaching their brain, they're reaching, visual cortex. Their eyes are fine, right? The visual pathways to primary visual cortex are totally fine. The damage is in their, parietal lobe in most cases. So there's some unconscious processing of the visual stimuli that they see. And this is really nicely shown by this classic experiment by Marshall and Halligan. I should say study, because they're studying a patient in this case, where they showed a patient with neglect these two houses. One is clearly on fire. The other is perfectly fine, but you'll notice the fire is on the left side of the house, so it's in the patient's left visual field, which they can't attend to. And they simply ask this patient, are these houses the same? The patient said, yeah, they're the same. Which of the houses would you rather live in? The patient said, silly question, they're the exact same, who cares? But then when pressed, when the experimenter said, but if you really had to choose, which one would you rather live in? The patient would pick the non-burning house. So there's some unconscious awareness here about these visual signals that are entering their brain, but they can't seem to bring them to the level of consciousness. And so it's a demonstration, right, of the role of attention in perception and conscious awareness. We have to attend to our world in order to perceive it. And if because of brain damage you can't attend to your left visual field, you don't seem to be consciously aware of what's happening in that visual field, even though those signals are coming into your brain. They're being processed by visual neurons and visual cortex. So neglect, although we tend to see it in relation to damage in the right hemisphere and the parietal lobe, we can also see it for damage in other parts of the right hemisphere, so in the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe as well. And unlike other cognitive systems we've talked about, like vision, for instance, which clearly relies on one primary sensory area, right? If you lose primary visual cortex, you will be blind, even if your eyes are fine. Attention seems to be more dispersed. So attention seems to rely more on networks that are dispersed throughout the brain. But like vision, we tend to think of attention as existing in two streams. So a ventral stream and a dorsal stream. And the ventral stream seems to be interested in changes in attention that relate to stimulus salience. So this is kind of like your bottom-up attentional stream. So shifts in attention driven by the salience of stimuli in our world, driven by bottom-up information. The dorsal attentional network seems to be driven more by top-down information, so prior knowledge. So neglect patients suggest that attention plays a role in bringing sensory information to perceptual awareness. How does attention change brain activity? In the last lecture, I showed you the Posner task. And so in this task, the idea is that you're cued to attend to one area in space. And if a stimuli appears in that location, you respond to it faster. And I proposed that attention basically facilitates, speeds up perception. And we can actually see that using EEG. So if we record ERPs, so event-related potentials from your brain in response to visual stimuli, we can see that these ERPs are actually increased in size when you're attending to the location in space where the visual stimulus appears. So in this 2008 study, participants stared at a fixation cross, and they were basically doing the Posner task. And so they were cued to, look to the right or to the left. And sometimes the cue matched the location of where the stimulus would appear. So an arrow pointed them to the left, and the stimulus appeared in that location. And on those trials, their brain activity is measured using electrocephalography was increased. And so you can see that in this image here. So the solid lines reflect trials in which they're attending to the location in space where the stimulus appears. The dashed lines reflect trials where they're attending to a location in space where the stimulus doesn't appear. So these are the invalid trials in the Posner task. And so the idea here is that attention is actually sort of amping up brain activity, or I should say, when you're attending to an area of your world and something appears there, the neural response, because that's what we're recording here, neural response, is actually increased, is actually boosted. And we can also see that using functional magnetic resonance imaging. So this is a very cool study where people were in an fMRI scanner, and they were asked to covertly attend to different regions of this stimulus disk, right? So they're lying in the scanner, staring at this disk, fixating on the center of the disk, and they're covertly shifting their attention to different regions, right? So maybe they shift their attention to, the northeast quadrant or the southeast quadrant, right? Or the southwest quadrant, the northwest quadrant, and so on. And while they're doing this, while they're being told to attend to different quadrants in this stimulus disk, the researchers are recording using functional magnetic resonance imaging the neural activity of primary visual cortex. And so remember, this is great. Exam review, fMRI, detects changes in the oxygen content of the brain. So what they're looking for are areas in visual cortex that are basically rich with oxygen. That suggests that there are neurons in that location that are more active. Now there's one other thing you need to know to understand this study, and that's that primary visual cortex actually contains a map of our world. So if you're staring at a stimulus disk like this, and you look at a certain part of the disk, you look at another part of the disk, that visual information will be maintained in an orderly fashion in primary visual cortex. So there's a map in visual cortex that to some extent reflects your visual world. If something appears, if a stimulus appears in the top right of your right visual field, we have some sense of where in visual cortex we'll actually see activity. If a stimulus appears in the bottom right of your visual field, we know that activity will occur in a different part of visual cortex. And so the researchers in that study used that to their advantage to examine how covert changes in attention change the activity of this spatial map in primary visual cortex. And so what they found was that activity in primary visual cortex was enhanced in the covertly attended spatial location. So let's break that down. So if we look at this image here, the top row reflects where they're attending, right? So this quadrant here versus this quadrant here versus this quadrant here, and so on. The rows below reflect the neural activity in visual cortex. And again, there's this map in visual cortex where the pattern of neural firing roughly reflects where things are happening in your world. And so what we see, right, is that when they're attending to the southeast quadrant of this visual stimulus, we see increased activity in the southeast quadrant of primary visual cortex. When they're attending to the northwest quadrant of that visual disk, sure enough, we see an increase in activity that's reflected by the yellow coloring in the northwest quadrant of primary visual cortex. And what's really cool was by looking at the pattern of activity in primary visual cortex, the researchers in this study were able to actually figure out where people were covertly attending. So at one point in the study, they said, covertly attend to wherever you like in this stimulus disk, and based on the pattern of brain activity they saw, they were able to figure out, decode where people were attending. So basically able to, read their minds based on the pattern of primary visual cortex activity. So super cool. Take-home message here is that, attention seems to facilitate or enhance the activity of primary sensory areas in the brain. And I've shown you evidence from vision, but presumably this works the same for audition, for all of our senses, right? If you suddenly decide to attend to your left hand and what you're touching in your left hand, this enhances the activity of neurons in somatosensory cortex, encoding information, touch information from your left hand. So we've come to the end of the lecture and the lecture review. Question 1. What is the binding problem? So question 1, what is the binding problem? Cells in visual cortex encode image features. And the binding problem simply asks, how does the brain keep track of what features go together? So if you're looking at multiple objects, how does the brain keep track of, what features go with what objects? What is feature integration theory? Question 2, what is feature integration theory? Feature integration theory proposes that attention solves the binding problem. Features you attend to are bound together. So they're kept together, and that's how when you look at a red circle and a green triangle, you see the circle as red and not as green, right? Its features are bound together because you're paying attention to the object. Question 3, what's the difference between a feature search and a conjunction search? Sort of a complicated question. What's the difference between a feature search and a conjunction search? If you recall, we looked at this in the context of providing evidence for feature integration theory. So feature searches involve searching for an object with a single unique feature. Conjunction searches involve searching for an object that has features that are shared across multiple objects that you're looking at. So the object you're searching for is a conjunction of features of different objects that are in the array. Feature searches are easier because you don't have to attend to every object in the search array to bind their features together. In the case of the conjunction search, right, you have to attend to each object to bind their features together and to perceive the objects as unique.